I became a sperm donor for my wife's sister. Consequences. I never thought life would take such an unexpected turn. Looking back, everything seems so ordinary, so simple. My wife, Rachel, and I had been married for 12 years, building a comfortable life in a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. We had 2 kids, a boy named Ethan, who had just turned 10, and our 7-year-old daughter, Lily. Life was steady, predictable, and in many ways perfect. Rachel stayed home with the kids, managing the household with a level of patience and grace I could never match, while I worked in real estate, juggling clients and listings, ensuring we had everything we needed. Rachel's sister, Claire, and her husband, Mark, were a big part of our lives. We spent almost every weekend together, grilling in the backyard, going on camping trips, or just sitting around the living room talking about anything and everything. Claire and Rachel were incredibly close, the kind of sisters who knew each other's thoughts before they were spoken. Claire was always full of life, the more outspoken of the two, while Rachel had a quiet wisdom about her. Mark and I got along well too. He was a financial analyst, a practical guy who enjoyed his job and took pride in his work. They had been married for nearly a decade, and while they seemed happy on the surface, there was an underlying sadness that hung between them, one that became more pronounced as the years went by. Claire and Mark wanted children. They had been trying since their 2nd year of marriage, going through rounds of doctor's appointments, fertility treatments, and failed attempts. The problem wasn't with Claire. She was healthy, fully capable of carrying a child. It was Mark. His tests showed low motility, low count, low everything. They had options, but none of them felt right. Adoption was discussed but never seriously pursued. They had thought about sperm donors, but the idea of bringing a stranger's DNA into their family felt impersonal and unsettling to them. So, year after year, they watched other couples have babies while their own dreams seemed further and further away. Rachel worried about her sister constantly. She knew how much Claire longed for a child, how every baby shower and family gathering was a reminder of what she couldn't have. I remember nights when Rachel would lie in bed next to me, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. When I'd ask what was on her mind, she'd just shake her head and say, "I just wish there was something we could do." I never pushed for more. Some things were better left unsaid. Then, one evening, Rachel, Claire, and their mother, Susan, had a conversation that changed everything. The 3 of them were inseparable, often getting together for coffee, shopping trips, or just long talks at Susan's house. I wasn't there that night, but when Rachel came home, I could tell she had something on her mind. She was quieter than usual, distracted. I assumed it was another tough conversation about Claire's struggles, but I had no idea what had actually been discussed. The next day, Rachel sat me down and told me everything. The 3 of them had come up with an idea, one that Claire had agreed to, and one that Susan had wholeheartedly supported. They wanted me to be the sperm donor for Claire and Mark's child. I didn't know what to say. At first, I thought Rachel was joking, testing my reaction. But she wasn't. She was serious, hopeful, almost pleading. She explained it in the most logical way possible. Claire would still get to experience pregnancy, the baby would be biologically connected to their family, and Mark would still be able to raise a child as his own. No outsiders, no unknown donors, just family. It made a kind of strange sense, but the weight of it was overwhelming. This wasn't just a simple favor. This was a life, a child who would share my DNA. I struggled to wrap my head around it. Rachel, sensing my hesitation, reassured me that it wouldn't change anything between us, that it was just a way to help Claire fulfill her dream of becoming a mother. I couldn't ignore the emotions bubbling inside me. What would Mark think? Did he truly want this, or was he just going along with it because he had no other choice? Would I be able to distance myself from a child that was biologically mine but raised by someone else? And what about Ethan and Lily? How would they feel knowing they had a half-sibling out there? Rachel told me to take my time to really think about it. And I did. I thought about it when I was at work, when I was driving, when I was playing with the kids. I tried to imagine a future where this child existed, where Claire had everything she had ever wanted, and where I had been the one to make it happen. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that I had to make a decision. Was I willing to change my family's life forever for the sake of helping someone else create theirs? On the second day, I sat down with Mark to talk about everything. It wasn't an easy conversation to have, and I could tell from the look in his eyes that it was something he had been dreading. He knew why I was there. He knew what we were asking of him. It was about his wife, Claire, and the chance for her to finally experience motherhood the way she had always dreamed. Mark was a proud man. He never spoke much about the struggles they had been facing, but we all knew. Every failed attempt, every visit to the doctor, every new treatment that ended in disappointment had chipped away at him. It wasn't Claire's fault. She was healthy. The issue was with him. And no matter how many times she reassured him that it didn't change her love for him, I could tell that deep down, it ate at him. When I told him what we had discussed, what Claire, my wife, and their mother had agreed upon, his reaction was as expected. He clenched his jaw, rubbed his temples, and let out a long sigh. He didn't explode in anger or reject the idea outright, but I could see the turmoil inside him. "I just want her to be happy," he finally said, after what felt like an eternity of silence. He wanted to do this for Claire, even though he hated the very idea of it. The fact that another man, his own brother-in-law, would be the biological father of his child was something he could barely wrap his mind around. But his love for Claire was greater than his pride. He told me he would do it, but there was hesitation in his voice. A hesitation that, at the time, I didn't pay enough attention to. I didn't say yes immediately. I took time to think it through. It felt like a heavy decision, and I didn't want to rush into it just because everyone else thought it was a good idea. My wife reassured me that it was for the best, that we were helping family. And in the end, I convinced myself of the same thing. This was about Claire and Mark. About their happiness. If I could help them, why wouldn't I? So I agreed. The procedure was done, and Claire became pregnant a few weeks later. The joy on her face when she found out was something I'll never forget. It was the happiness of a woman who had waited for so long, who had prayed for this moment. She and Mark held each other tightly, and for a little while, it seemed like everything was going to be okay. But then Mark started drinking. At first, it was subtle. A few drinks here and there, a bit more often than before. But then it became a pattern. It was no longer about relaxing after a long day. It was about drowning something inside him. He wouldn't say it outright, but I knew what was bothering him. He had agreed to this, but now that it was happening, it was real in a way he hadn't expected. He was going to raise a child that wasn't biologically his. And the thought of that consumed him. His coworkers found out. Whether he told them himself or they pieced it together, I don't know. But once they knew, the teasing began. They made jokes, cruel ones, about how the child wasn't really his, about how another man had to do what he couldn't. And Mark, already struggling with his own doubts, took it hard. He stopped looking at Claire the same way. He stopped coming home on time. He began spending more nights drinking with his coworkers, coming home late, his words slurred, his patience short. Claire tried to be understanding, tried to remind him that this was their baby no matter what, but Mark wasn't hearing it. He resented everything, the situation, himself, me, even Claire in some ways, though he would never admit it. Their arguments became frequent. What had once been a loving, unbreakable bond started to crack under the weight of everything unspoken between them. And then, one night, he didn't come home at all. Claire was alone, heavily pregnant, worried sick, calling him over and over, but he didn't pick up. She called my wife, she called me, but we had no idea where he was. The hours passed and still no word. That night, I sat with my wife in our living room, watching Claire's name light up on my phone, hearing the worry in her voice, and I knew. This was not how things were supposed to go. This was not how any of us had imagined it. We had done this to help Claire and Mark build a family, but instead, we had unknowingly planted a seed of doubt and pain that was now growing out of control. I wished, more than anything, that I had seen this coming, that I had thought harder before agreeing, that I had asked Mark what he really felt, not just what he was willing to say. Because now, Claire was alone, carrying a child that was supposed to bring them happiness, but instead had become a symbol of Mark's deepest insecurities. And Mark was lost, caught between love and resentment, between pride and shame, drowning himself in alcohol while the life he had built slowly crumbled around him. Mark returned home 2 days later, but it wasn't the return Claire had prayed for. He looked hollow, like a man who had been running from himself and finally collapsed under the weight of his own choices. He reeked of alcohol and regret, but there was no apology on his lips, no promises to try again, no explanation for where he had been. He had come for one reason only, to leave for good. I watched as he moved through the house, gathering his things with a vacant expression, his hands shaking as he stuffed clothes into a duffel bag. Claire stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes swollen from the tears she had been shedding since the night he didn't come home. She was still in her maternity dress, the fabric stretched over the life growing inside her, the life they had fought so hard to bring into existence. And yet, despite everything, Mark wouldn't even look at her. She reached out to him, but he shrugged her off. I could hear her quiet, gasping breaths, the way her shoulders trembled. She didn't scream or shout. There was something more devastating in her silence. The air was thick with words unsaid, the ones that could have saved them if spoken earlier. But it was too late. Mark zipped up his bag, his movements abrupt and final. And then, in the heaviest moment of all, he turned and met my eyes. I expected anger, blame, something directed at me. But all I saw was defeat. "I don't respect myself anymore," he muttered. "I didn't do this because I wanted to. I did this to make her happy. But now, I don't even know who I am." With that, he walked out, leaving Claire standing in the doorway, one hand clutching her belly, the other covering her mouth as if trying to hold back the sobs threatening to escape. When the front door closed behind him, it was as if all the air had been sucked from the room. The silence was suffocating. For the next hour, Claire didn't move. She just stood there, staring at the space where Mark had been, her breath coming in uneven gasps. Then something inside her broke. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number with shaking fingers. When the call connected, she didn't even try to keep her voice steady. "This is your fault." I didn't have to ask who she was calling. My wife, her sister, the one who had planted the idea in her mind, the one who had convinced Mark to go along with something he never truly wanted, the one who had unknowingly set this disaster into motion. Claire's voice was raw, filled with anger and pain and betrayal. The words spilled out, sharp and cutting, accusations thick with emotion. Every word she had kept bottled up now poured out in a flood of resentment. The bond they had shared as sisters shattered in that moment, replaced by a bitter divide that might never be mended. My wife, on the other end of the call, was in shock. She had only wanted to help. We had all thought this would be something beautiful, something that would bring us closer as a family. But instead, it had destroyed them. I sat there, numb, realizing the full weight of what had happened. How had we all been so blind? How had we convinced ourselves that this was a good idea? We thought we were giving them a gift. Instead, we had taken everything from them, their love, their trust, their family. Even my mother, who had supported the decision, now carried the weight of guilt. She had believed in the plan, thinking it was an act of love and generosity. But love doesn't always fix things. Sometimes it breaks them beyond repair. Days turned into weeks. Mark was gone. Claire was alone, carrying a child that was both hers and yet a reminder of everything she had lost. The sisters stopped speaking. Our once close family now felt like a house divided, each of us nursing our own wounds in silence. And me? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had played a part in all of this. I had gone along with it, rationalized it, told myself it was the right thing to do. But was it? Or had we all been too caught up in our own emotions to see the inevitable fallout? As I sat in the quiet of our home, I realized something I wished I had understood before. Every action has consequences, some unseen, some impossible to predict. We had thought we were doing something selfless, something that would bring happiness. But we had ignored the deeper truths, the emotions that couldn't be neatly contained or rationalized. Mark's pride, Claire's desperation, my wife's good intentions, my own complacency. It had all led to this moment, and there was no undoing it, no fixing what had been broken. In the end, I realized something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Before making a choice that will change everything, you have to ask yourself, are you ready to live with the consequences? Because once the choice is made, there's no going back.